Hello, thank you very much for joining the Deborah and Mon show on pressing refresh on employee relations. Deborah, can I have the next slide, please? So this morning we're going to actually not talk about hybrid working, because we've made some assumptions that all of you are now either in your ways of work, and for some that may have been always in situ in the office or in the manufacturing or production or retail post-pandemic, or you're actually implementing and looking how hybrid working works for you, or you've moved to remote working, or having all three. So what we will be doing though is answering any questions that you may have, because the shadow of COVID in the workplace still runs very long. But what we will be talking about is how are these new ways of work and the trends that will impact next year. So what are the legal issues that we think you should be thinking about, and the wider trends as well. Can I have the next slide? So we are really looking at what does the workplace of next year looks like. I am so all over this year. I've had enough already. And this may be partly because where we are in the pandemic. It's also culturally. So on Thursday, it is Diwali. It's a new start in my culture. And generally, you normally in Diwali send really cheesy messages to your families, and they're normally along the lines of, you know, I wish you lots of health, wealth, and happiness. And actually, I don't think those sentiments are a bad thing to wish for in 2022. And lots of businesses are actually relying on there being an upward turn, certainly in terms of the pandemic. And that not impacting their businesses. So what we will see next year is that we think that there will be tweaking of the hybrid working or whatever working practices that you have. So it's this idea that we will see employers doing their pulse surveys, finding out what works for them, what is not working, and sort of finessing that kind of information, so it's a little bit more of a smooth run. I do think that most organisations really do need to give themselves 3 to 6 months of a trial period to see what their model really does look like and iron out any of those issues. When employees were working remotely, studies are sort of showing these are the things that they noticed. They noticed that in the middle of a crisis in the pandemic, employers were much better at making decisions. You made faster decisions, and they welcomed that. So there was a lot of appreciation that there wasn't so much red tape in organisations. They're also saying that there needs to be more effective meetings. What lots of organisations are doing is just cutting their meetings down, so you can't do a meeting that's more than 45 minutes or 25 minutes. This is because of a relatively large survey of employees in the UK. Half of them said that every meeting, that every half of every meeting was a waste of time. So it's about that kind of efficiency. What we've also seen is what was always happening before, the use of technology, and the pandemic accelerated employers using technology. So there's more technology available to employers. They've implemented new technologies to assist in working. And this means from a HR perspective that there is so much more data and knowledge and resources that really we need to look at, including the artificial intelligence models, so that there is a real open discussion and a dialogue with employees about what the technology does, how the employer will use it, and actually allow employees to debate with you and put ideas and become champions. Because although Deborah will touch on how employees don't like surveillance, the reality is this data is useful to both employers and employees. What employees don't like is when they feel that it's being used in a manner which they weren't aware of. So it's having that dialogue about actually what is working. They say that all of the machines that we use now, the touch screens, you know, if I gave my child a phone, he wouldn't know how to press numbers, it's all swiping. That came because an Apple employee was so fed up of using a stylus pen, and some of you might not even remember what a stylus pen was, and that was the jump to have the technology in all of the, you know, single touch equipment that we have that's been so useful. So actually getting employees onboarded and really working with the technology is really likely to give us better use and insight because we're going to see this acceleration of the workplace via technology, and that really will come via the employees. One of the complaints was that actually the technology was just imposed, and they accepted it at that time because they realized in the pandemic it was necessary, and we're now in a different part of that discourse. Can I have the next slide, please? So lots of you and lots of the papers will say good management is about empowering people so they make the decisions, and you put the parameters around those decisions and they make the right decisions. So lots of you will have these wonderful, you know, we trust you employees, we will trust you to do the right thing, you know, work when it suits you, but we trust you to come into the office when there is a need. For the legal perspective, that works relatively well for lots of people, but we, especially Deborah and I, only deal with generally when things go wrong. And the law actually says that the employer needs to have clear lines. They need to have actually red lines. And there has been more inquiries coming in where people are saying, well, we've gone back to hybrid working. They've all agreed to hybrid working. They say that they're willing to try it, but they're seeing some resistance when they're coming back into hybrid working. And that may be for lots of reasons, which you need to explore with employees and understand. But lots of employers, and I would certainly be saying to them is, look, we are in a new model of working that has inbuilt flexibility. Yeah, some of your colleagues can't work hybrid, you can. So if we're asking you to come into the office 3 days a week, we expect you to do those 3 days a week. We do not expect to have debates with you about those 3 days. Or you might be sort of saying is that, yes, sometimes there will be flexibility, sometimes you can't come in on certain days, but actually we will be looking at the times that you are in so that you're noticing patterns of behaviour, because you might be finding that there is always that one employee that always has a really good excuse of why they're not coming in. And it's not so much to chastise them, but it's to really try and get at the root of the problem, and also, you know, explain to them and give them the evidence why actually hybrid working works well, but you do need to sometimes be in the office or seeing clients. So there is really still this need to set out your red lines so that not everything is a debate, and it actually frees up managers' time so that they're concentrating on what really works well in your ways of work going forward. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so lots of employers have really good initiatives on mental health and well-being. What the trends are saying is that that's great, but actually it needs to be a business mandate going forward, i.e. it's absolutely necessary. When we've been doing training to frontline managers, actually I've not met any manager who hasn't said, you know what, I'm tired, I'm really tired, this has been a hard pandemic. And psychologically, you know that if you're resetting your new agenda for 2002 from a HR perspective, that actually means that there's got to be a closing of 1 year and an opening of another. Part of the pandemic has been this, we've just been lurching from one tier for what that means and going forward. And sometimes it's quite important to sort of stop and say, look, we start again, this is what this means. But the whole idea is that clearly this idea about health being so integral to work will continue. One of the earlier studies in the pandemic had indicated that employees were being the lines between work and home were being so blurred that employees were actually of the view that their personal problems was the employer's problems, this idea of it's more a holistic approach to life. And that feeds into this idea that actually you have to look after employees. So although 2/3 of employees do provide mental health, the other need that employees were saying is that actually they want financial well-being advice, that the pandemic has brought to light, their fragility or their future, and triggered lots of other discussions. And actually only 40% of employers were doing anything with that regard. And of that 40%, it wasn't very comprehensive. So this is one of the new asks that are coming onto employees' agenda, and quite rightly so, bearing in mind there'll be very few of you on this call that's on a final salary pension scheme, and if you are, don't move. So essentially it will be a far more pressing issue. In this 18 months, although I'm really pleased to be saying I'm not seeing at this stage large-scale redundancies, which would worry me. What we are seeing is people trying to get on with their businesses, but there has, without a shadow of doubt, been slimming down of organisations in the pandemic. And employers that have had really good detailed wellbeing programs in place, where they are offering, not only access to an employee assistance program, but GPs, medical services, healthcare, gyms, all of that. They're also entering into an open dialogue with their employees to sort of say, actually, it's really important for both you and us that you remain well. Yeah, we will always try and support you, but we are a different organisation. So if somebody goes off ill, the impact on their colleagues is going to be more if there is less of you and you are stretched. And it's sort of making employees really be proactive about their health, because we are saying to them, actually, we will make adjustments, for those with medical conditions, but those adjustments may not last for a year or 6 months. And being really open with employees to say, actually, we have to be really proactive. So we would encourage you to seek help and be proactive about your health as soon as possible. One of the initiatives that worked really well for an employer who was having issues with people wearing masks is, and they were actually they were one of the gains in the pandemic. So their production at a site just absolutely increased because they were in the medical arena. What they did for those who were anxious about wearing a mask, where there was no underlying physical breathing problem, is that they said, look, you have got 4 weeks to do cognitive behaviour therapy to get over the anxiety, because the adjustment is looking for how you can do your job, not to just remove the task that is uncomfortable for you. And that had a really good outcome. And what I mean with good outcome is that we're not facing tribunal claims, and that nobody lost their job as a result of it, which is the best outcome. Can I have the next slide? So it's a really old rule, but if you want to know what your employees want, employers have to listen and they have to learn from that. So the pulse surveys would be very useful. My own view is that I think employees say something, but they do different things. And that's maybe not consciously, it's just that they're getting used to the ways of work and that resistance. But in a survey of 10,000 UK employees, this is what they came up with about benefits that they would like for next year. So they want employee discounts, supermarkets eating out. They want greater recognition of work, although that wasn't expanded on about what that means in terms of whether that is the soft thank yous or greater financial recognition. They want more holidays. I would just say at this point that if you are in a financial year that ends even next April, but certainly this year, I suspect lots of people have got lots of holidays, because we were holding on to holidays thinking that we would maybe get some sun, and some of us just haven't been brave enough to even get that sun. So using up the holidays or allowing carryover and the consequences of that. They really appreciate at-home entertainment, so our Netflix box sets have clearly made an impact. Obviously, other subscription sites are available. They love free food, and they want a present for their birthday. So I was quite surprised at this list, but again, this shows that if you don't ask your employees what they want, there might be some real short gifts that you can give that have value to them, which may not necessarily have value to others. There is also, I think, certainly around the corner, especially with the increase of home expenses, such as fuel cost, this concept of financial share. So employees will be saying to you, well, actually our pay should increase because you've shut down 6 offices, or you don't have those office costs anymore. Therefore, that concept of financial share should also come to us. Also, although we're very happy to work from home 2, 3, whatever days a week there is, you know, my household bills have increased, and there's clear merit to that. So what, again, employers need to do is do their analytics, because there may have been cost savings that came across when people aren't working from home, like their commute costs and things like that, and that offsets it. But it's about getting that data and that positioning ready. Clearly, there might be also tax consequences. Do not get me started on company cars and what to do with them if they are hybrid workers and not really using it for work in the same way. Next slide. So again, what is being threatened is 2 things. A, there'll be a mass load of resignations, and we already know that there is a talent war. I'm happy for anybody of the attendees to say, yeah, Mon, I've had no problem recruiting, because that's not certainly the message that we're seeing. And, you know, I can see this within my own organisation. So of a global workforce, they said 41 were considering leaving, changing their professions. And I think, you know, that's obviously understandable. While people have been in the pandemic, they sort of froze because they didn't want to take a risk. Also, you know, everybody's had a bit of a life crisis and reevaluating what work means to them. We already know that the future of work will mean that 1 in 16 will need a different occupation. So just for HR, so I know that you are all looking at your fantastically increased budgets and what you're going to do with that. These are roles within the HR departments that they say should exist within the next 2 to 5 years. So these are immediate needs. So there's to be a chat box and human facilitator. So this is obviously a robot, and I can see some of the queries, the you know, simple queries would easily be done by a robot. That would be quite helpful and useful and free up HR people to do some of the more strategic and more difficult operational stuff. You're to have a HR data detective. I really do like the sound of that. An AI biased auditor, and we know the reasons why, that if the computer are making decisions, we need to ensure that they're not picking against protected groups. Working from home facilitator, so this may be somebody who's just ensuring that this hybrid working is working, and those risk assessments that have already been done are being continued to be done, and checking in. And obviously within the HR department, a climate change response leader. So you either carve out these titles to your existing long list of titles of your own job, or look towards what do the future of HR look. And what we've also seen is that as people have found it difficult to recruit and the market is very tight, that they are, how are they retraining their people? And actually, lots of employers are looking at the emerging skills, and they are looking at those critical and more softer skills that can carry across each of the occupations, as well as hard IT skills. It's interesting that where AI can be really useful is in training. So it could help you assess what people are lingering longer on in training, what they are finding more interesting, those kind of research, not on an individual basis, but maybe on a group basis to start with. I would hate for AI to be assessing your reactions to this webinar, because I'm sure some of the facial recognitions I would not be happy with. We've also seen that organisations have been doing within organisation promotion. So this idea of promoting everybody up because it's easier to recruit perhaps at lower levels, especially if you're starting on apprenticeship schemes and at the community level. That's been a bit hit and miss. So really, where we've not had people transfer successfully across, organisations need to look at the why that didn't happen properly and try and put in more tools. So they're filtering better, but also they're upskilling their staff to go into those rules. And this idea of having more of a liquid slide. So if a role is not successful, they can slide back, or you're very clear with them that the back role will be backfilled. And so this is a big jump for them. But there is some work I think organisations need to do so the promotion up is successful or sideways, whatever that may be. Next slide. The next slide is actually Deborah's going to talk about things that are really hitting the press, including this proposal on flexible working from day one. I won't comment, save to say that there are still significant numbers of employment legislation from the Taylor report which were badly needed that haven't been implemented. So I wonder whether there's been very little employment reform in the last 2 years. So I do wonder whether this is just press headlines. And you will have noted last week that the bill to stop firing and rehiring has not been passed. But in my experience, most employers haven't used that necessarily just to enforce worse terms. They've done it for very good substantive reasons where there's been a change. So Deborah, over to you for flexible working.
Thank you, Monica. Hello, everybody. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to do a recap on the current law on the employee's right to make a flexible working request. Now, this is actually almost 20 years old, this particular piece of law, and there are 3 reasons why I'm going to be covering old law in this refresh webinar. And one is Monica had just been talking about the Great Resignation and the talent wars, and we know from the pandemic that people are looking for this better work-life balance, and that if you put a flexible working in your advertisement, you're going to be attracting far more talent to the organisation. You may also retain more talent. The government have currently put this flexible working consultation out. It actually came out before the pandemic, and one of the things that they are looking at is whether people should have a right from day one to request flexible working. But as Monica says, whether this will ever come into fruition, we don't know. So the third reason for looking at flexible working requests is because business clients have been telling me that some of their employees are getting confused over flexible working, hybrid working, what they've been able to do during the pandemic when everybody was working from home, and what they can do now. So if you're putting your hybrid working policies into place and you require people back 2 days, 1 day, 3 days, whichever office it may be, what do you do when somebody says, well, that doesn't suit me? So let's have a look at the current law on flexible working. There we go. So it's a statutory right to request a change to the employment contract, for example, hours, time, place of work. And that can be a permanent change unless it's agreed otherwise. And the key point at the moment is that it's limited to employees, not to workers, not to agency workers. And the request has got to come to from somebody who's been continuously employed for 26 weeks. And what's more, they currently only have the right to make 1 flexible working request per year. Now, the ACAS code on flexible working suggests that employers and employees talk about it first before putting in a flexible working request. And as you can see from some of the advertisements we see now for jobs, it will say flexible working. But what we suggest is that employers need to think carefully about how the flexible working might work in future, whether the role is suitable for flexible working, so that if requests come in down the line, then they will have some idea of how they're going to respond. Although, of course, they will need to respond to the individual's particular request. So, under the current law, there is no need for the employee to give a reason for wanting flexible working. When it first came out about almost 20 years ago, it was for carers of children aged 6 and under, and it gradually expanded to older children, to disabled members of the family. And then in 2014, then anybody was able to make a flexible working request. And hopefully, I think what we might find now is that when somebody does make a flexible working request, that it should be value free. We know particularly that the younger generation have put a great deal of emphasis and importance on work-life balance, as well as families making the work-life balance a priority, often a priority over salary. So if somebody wants to work a 4-day week rather than 5, or maybe compress all their hours into 4 days because they want to look after their mental and physical health, they want to pursue hobbies, they want to relax on that extra day, then let's make it value free. Why shouldn't they make that request? But we're still in this formal system at the moment, and the request has to be made in writing. It needs to specify the change, the date the change is going to happen. And also the employee, still under this formal system, needs to explain the effect the change will have on the employer and how the employer can deal with it. Oh, I beg your pardon, I've gone the wrong way. There we go, next one. So the employer's current duties on responding to a flexible working request, and many of you may have been dealing with these types of requests over the past 15, 16 years. The employer's duties are to deal with the request in a reasonable manner, to notify them within 3 months of the request or longer if agreed, and only refuse the flexible working request for 1 or more of 8 business reasons. And again, many of you may be familiar with these because they've been around a long time. But let's have a look at these 8 business reasons within the context of today, and as Monica says, of 2022, when our hybrid working has settled down and the trial periods are perhaps over and businesses know how they want their hybrid working to go forward. So look at those 2 boxes on the top line, the second and the third box. One business reason to turn down a flexible working request is that it will have a detrimental effect on the ability to meet customer demand and ability to reorganise work amongst existing staff. So we know we've got a recruitment crisis. It may well be that you simply don't have enough staff to agree to somebody's request to work fewer hours. Have a look at the next 2 as well: detrimental impact on quality, detrimental impact on performance. Let's suppose during the lockdown, when many people had to work from home, they got into the habit of being very, very flexible in that they may work later on when the children have gone to bed, when the homeschooling's had to finish. But suppose there's a team. I had a query from HR manager of a publishing company, and some of the designers and journalists would like to work very late at night and send their copy in, but this put huge pressure on the production team in the morning, who had to get the work, the magazine ready for the schedule for delivery and print and so on. And so by allowing this complete flexibility of some staff, it had this detrimental effect on the others. And so if you're setting your hybrid working, you may be wanting to think about how the teams will work together, which members of the team need to be in the same place at the same time, if in fact they do. So my next point is about enforcement of flexible working requests in the Employment Tribunal. And an employee can submit a claim where the employer fails to deal with the claim in a reasonable manner, they make a decision based on the wrong facts, or the application is wrongly treated as withdrawn. But the compensation here for a flexible working request breach is only 8 weeks pay, and that's subject to the statutory cap, which is currently at £554 a week. That's the same statutory cap that you find in statutory redundancy pay. The second point that's important to note is that employees have a right not to be subjected to a detriment, that's legal language for not treated unfairly, or dismissed because they've made a flexible working request. And the important point to note here is that somebody doesn't need any length of service to bring a dismissal claim. You'll know that a normal unfair dismissal claim, the employee needs 2 years length of service, but not so here. So going back a few slides and back to what Monica was talking about, recruitment and so on, imagine you're advertising your roles. You're saying flexible working, yes, absolutely, we're a flexible working employee, we encourage it, and so on. They then start the role. The flexibility that they want and expect doesn't suit the rest of the team. It inhibits the business's ability to deliver its products or services to its customers, or it puts unfair pressure on the other employees. But if that new person has then formally puts in a flexible working request that's turned down, remember they may bring a claim for automatic unfair dismissal. There may not be any merit in that claim, of course, but there's nothing to stop them bringing the claim. So you need to be very careful. And what we recommend is that when you are looking at roles, think in advance, how might this work on a flexible basis? So on to my next slide. Now you notice that I've got that cap of 8 weeks capped pay is your only compensation. And so there are very few standalone flexible working claims. And also the employer has such a wide range of reasons to reject a flexible working campaign. So claim. So it's no surprise that many flexible working requests are joined with discrimination claims under the Equality Act. So I'm just going to quickly recap Section 19 of the Equality Act, which covers indirect sex discrimination. And apologies for those of you who know this very well already. So I'll be brief, but indirect discrimination happens when a business applies a policy that looks neutral and to everybody. For example, the hours of work, the location of work. It's called a provision criteria or practice, a PCP for short. Now that policy is applied to everybody, but it disadvantages one group in particular because of their protected characteristic. That may be because of their gender, because of their religion, because of a particular disability. And the individual who has that protected characteristic, then it disadvantages them in particular. Now, an employer has a business justification to indirect discrimination claims. That's when there's a legitimate reason for applying that policy and there wasn't a less disadvantageous disadvantageous way to apply that policy to the person. So let's have a look at this in the context of women. So a business applies a policy that nobody can be absent from the workplace between the hours of, say, 2 and 5 o'clock. Now that may be school picking up time. That would disadvantage the group of people, i.e. women, who are the main carers of dependent children if they can't get to school to pick the children up. The individual is also disadvantaged. She may have a direct indiscrimination claim. And I'm talking about women because this childcare disparity has come up again in the press lately. It's been talking about have women been particularly disadvantaged during the pandemic because they have been the main carers of children, the one who have taken the most, shouldered the most burden of homeschooling and so on. And so the question is, does it still go without saying that women are the main carers of dependent children? In other words, can they still claim this group disadvantage in indirect discrimination claims? And yes, say to recent tribunals. So my first one is it's an employment appeal tribunal case, which means it's binding on tribunals lower down, the tribunals of first instance. And this was about judicial notice. And what judicial notice is, it's a device where if you, for example, if it means the tribunal doesn't have to investigate or review evidence of something that's put forward. So if you say the 17th and 18th of October 1999 was a weekend, that can be given as judicial notice. And so in this case, it said judicial notice should have been taken of the fact that women, because of childcare responsibilities, were less likely to accommodate certain working patterns than men. I'm just going to do one more. I can see Monica's come back on, so she's ready to do her next part, so I'll speed up. Another case was Chloe Daly and BA City Flyer, and the tribunal held that part-time working and a more predictable working pattern are often of particular benefit to women. And therefore, when you're looking at flexible working, hybrid working, remember that it may be that the carers, be they men or women, who do need that certainty of what hours they're going to be working. I'm handing back to Monica now. I'll be back later on for a very brief look at employee monitoring. Monica.
So can I have the next slide? So Deborah was talking about this presumption, which is the courts will say that women take the burden of the childcare. And I would have actually argued against that because the trends would have been that men are more actively involved in childcare, but it does depend on the sector and the age of the employees. But I have certainly argued with some success in lower courts, but well before this period. And personally, I remember 30 years going to my first equality women's international conference, and they were talking about women's rights, and one very small but powerful female voice said, "Where are the men? Make the men do more." Certainly in my house, both my husband and I work part-time, and my mum will say that my husband is a better mum than I, but we won't go into that. But I think I'm wrong about, I think the court is right that women still take the majority of the childcare. And there's another bit of evidence which supports that, is the gender pay reports. The reports were delayed, but they are now in. And actually this year makes for very disappointing reading, because depending on how you read the statistics, and of course on each of the reports nobody's actually checking the actual statistics, and that's one of the criticisms, but the gender pay still very much remains. Depending on the reports, it's widened or reduced depending on how you read the reports. But what is also certain in that the UK came joint last across 10 developed countries in their gender pay reporting and in tackling the issue. And one of the reasons for that, there's lots of reasons for it, but one of the reasons is that we just report. There is no obligation to close the gap. And there is this movement which is saying actually employers have to make positive steps towards closing that gap. Can I have the next slide? Now, in all your gender pay reports, it will say gender pay is not the same as equal pay, but there is a correlation between gender pay and equal pay. So when I'm acting for claimants, particularly in recent high-profile cases, I always look at one and say, oh, there might be an issue here, and there always is. And what employers are doing is actually taking pay inequality, but looking at it in a much broader holistic approach. My own rule in life is, certainly as a managing partner, is I won't do anything for the business unless it's got 3 distinct benefits to the business, one not being obvious related to the issue. So it's really about driving value. And I do worry that if employers are just looking at one particular sector, that they're perhaps abandoning the reasons why there's other reasons for pay inequality, because it is very complex. So what employers are doing audits. Now, the audits can be narrow or as wide, but they have to be they have to have depth. So what they're doing is they're looking at all of the initiatives that employers have, because lots of you have very good initiatives that you've started, but they're joining them up and seeing the impact of that right from the beginning, i.e. recruitment at school level, all the way down to retirement. And they're also looking at those subjective points of pay parity. Lots of employers haven't even done the easy one, which is like work, which is, you know, man and woman, same role, are they paid the same? And actually, if you look at those deep dive statistics in your organisation, you will find some disparity. Of the case that I was talking about, and I won't do a claimant high profile case for many years, it really did take it out of me. But not only was there gender pay reporting, but they didn't do a subject access request properly. And the subject access request actually gave us all the pay details across the organisation. And that showed that every male in the same role was paid more than every female with the same title. So it's about doing that double check on your systems, but then also looking at the points, so like reviews, why are some people getting more increases, and looking at all of the subjective elements to making sure that if there is a pay disparity, you can rely on your defence. Now that may be just one department, it might be a whole organisation, but spending some time so you're looking at your documents for a very different reason than pay points is where employers are dealing with, particularly as there's been a huge increase in equal pay claims. And you'll have seen from the retailers, although they're very long-standing, this idea of a shop worker can compare themselves now to a distribution centre. They've all gone through the preliminary trying to saying no, it's a different employer. They've all failed on that. So we're now at those substantive tests and whether employers can deal with those claims. In terms of risk, they're relatively significant for employers. So doing a bit of work now actually is a really good risk prevention measure. So Deborah's now going to talk about whether in this age of where everything is recorded, whether you can do surveillance on employees. And we probably have 2 very different views on this, but I will let Deborah share her correct view.
I'll share my view with my boss and with you. So we know that monitoring staff who are working from home is widely disliked. A YouGov poll in September 20, 48% said it would damage their relations with their line manager, and this increased to 62% from younger workers. And so the question is, how much monitoring of staff working from home is really necessary, and what can be replaced by mutual trust, respect and collaboration? So be absolutely clear, employers have a legitimate interest in the smooth running of their company and checking that staff are doing their professional duties. And meanwhile, the individual has an Article 8 right to their family and private life, to their home and their correspondence. There's no one law that's either sanctions or prohibits monitoring staff who are working from home. And on the next slide, I'll show you some of the laws that do apply, and it is rather a complex list, but nevertheless, there needs to be a balance. And there are many reasons that the employer may need to monitor staff who are working from home. And this can be, for example, to make sure that staff aren't harassing others or going on to any discriminatory websites when they're at home. I'm talking, of course, about when people are working on their devices supplied by the employer. You may need to monitor staff's performance. You may need to record conversations that staff are having with customers. You may also want to make sure from a wellbeing point of view that employees aren't working late into the night when really they ought to be doing more regular office hours and getting some rest. Meanwhile, the Article 8 rights of the individual, they're found in the Human Rights Act. Only people in the public sector can directly enforce those Article 8 rights, but they are employment tribunals do have to take Article 8 rights into account. So they apply to the private employer as well, private sector employer. So here's a list of some of the acts that will apply when monitoring staff working from home. And you can see at the bottom there, the bottom few bullets, a lot on the data protection, the GDPR. And we do have another webinar coming up at the end of November, specifically on GDPR. Which I would really encourage you to attend, because it's going to be really valuable. Monitoring staff at home is going to be such a key issue coming up. One of the things that we might find under the Employment Rights Act, for example, is that if the monitoring of staff is over-intrusive, it's unnecessary, it's disproportionate, that may lead to a breach of trust, and that breach of trust and confidence, and that may lead to constructive unfair dismissal claims. So whistle stop there through monitoring staff at working from home, but we do have an article on it that we'll send to you afterwards. I'm handing back to Monica now, because Monica's been collecting questions that have been coming in.
Thank you, and we will be also sending copies of the slides to the delegates, particularly if you find that useful. So we do have a couple of questions. The harder one is for you, Deborah, I think, but let me deal with question one, which is directed to me. Mon, can I ask, the medical company that asked employees to seek CBT, did they make this available to their staff, or was it the employee's responsibility? So that's a really interesting question. So generally, because of the size of that organisation, and because they were seeing that it was quite an issue that was significant in the workforce. It wasn't just a handful of people feeling anxious, it was quite a lot of people feeling anxious in their ability to wear masks, which were mandatory at that time, that they just talked to their medical provider, which lots of you do have, and lots of you have the apps, and they, for a relatively small charge, did the courses for there. So there was a cost which they bore in those circumstances, but it wasn't particularly excessive, and it was because they really was in a position where it was quite right for them to wear masks at that time, and an employer is entitled to set their rules on PPE. It's not for the employee to say or dictate the rules on that to an employer. But say you're a really small organisation and you have an individual who's saying, I've got anxiety, it makes me feel claustrophobic, I can't wear a mask, or whatever the medical reason may be, I can't do this. It is perfectly acceptable for an employer to say, well, the reasonable adjustment is that I can't put up with that, because the consequences of me putting up with that is the impact on X, Y, and Z. Employers aren't very good at noting the evidence on the impact of a reasonable adjustment on others, and judges absolutely will turn their head and take great heed at that. So it's really very valuable in the if you're dealing with a disability, which lots of these reasons may be. It's perfectly reasonable for an employer to say, actually, we're going to give you 4 weeks, please go and get treatment. I think the only proviso I would say is that, you know, the NHS and their ability to provide mental health services is very limited at the moment. So you might just be offering something that they can't really follow up, depending on the worker, their salary level. So I would be saying that actually it's something employers should consider if it's something that has that solution. I was listening to the radio that the psychiatrist who thought about CBT, they were honouring him, he passed away today, and they were saying that that kind of therapy about changing your mind, which is essentially what all of next year will be about. It's about how we all change our sense of direction and keep on going at this speed and dealing with the challenges that we have, how valuable that tool has been. So the answer is it depends, but I would be saying to employers, actually 4 weeks course would be cheaper than you going through a dismissal process or getting somebody new in, if that is the one little help that that employee needs. So the question to Deborah is, if a flexible working request is to permanently work from home on 3 days per week, but the business decides we want to keep flexibility and not have set days at home, is there a legitimate reason to decline under the 8 reasons? So, you know, your lovely little 8 red boxes. So, Deborah, do you want to deal with that? And I can always add in if I think of something different.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. So I think we touched on them earlier on. If they say, I want 3 days, whatever I want, some of the legitimate reasons for turning that down will be on the ability, on quality, for the team may need to be with other people on those days. So it would be on that, it will be on the ability to service clients and so on. So yes, you can. Of those 8 business reasons, you could probably find 5, maybe 4 or 5 actually, but particularly not being able to deliver the service quality to clients or to share amongst the team. If that team need to be together on a particular day. What I would add though is be careful of, if you've brought people back in, and this did crop up with a business client of mine, she had this question. The senior people often didn't come in, but the more junior people felt they had to come in. What is the point of somebody coming into the office if they're going to be sitting on their own while the other is still at home? And the other thing about when people come back into the office, if they're working almost in solitude at their desks but next to each other, might it be better to arrange, when you need to get people together to talk about something, to say, I know Monica was talking about let's not have too many meetings earlier on, but make a point of those people face to face. Let's discuss this or let's deal with that, rather than just come on in on those days and have an ad hoc over the desk, shall we do it like this or that. If you concentrate perhaps on something that you need to do that would be harder to do by Zoom or email, that might be a good way to do things.
I think in most practical senses, most employers are saying, look, let's aim for having these 3 days where you're in the office, so that we can plan activities that make best use of those 3 days or the office or at client sites or whatever that means. Of course, there's going to be occasion when there's flexibility. So, you know, if we get a listing for a tribunal hearing, I can't say to the judge, I'm really sorry, I can't rock up to Birmingham today. You know, it's almost inbuilt like it's always been. But there may be some further compromise, because the idea is that there will be consequences to individuals if they have to be flexible all of the time, like childcare, you know, commuting costs. Although I understand that if you're commuting 3 days in on travel, you might as well get a card for that entire period. And Deborah's nodding away, so we've both been through this kind of experience. So I think there are things that there might be some more compromise around, but again, it's not just dictating the rules, it's sort of saying, well, actually, how am I maximising performance for the time you're at home and at the time you're in the office? We have just gone over the 45 minutes, although I think we did quite well with timing. I don't think there are any more questions. We will stay on till the bitter end, but thank you very much. And if anybody wants any questions, they can answer in. I'm going to get another picture done now. I think yeah, today I'm going to go and get another picture done. But thank you very much for joining us. Email us with any questions. We hope you found this session useful. If there's any other topics that you want to go in for 2022, we won't be doing one in December, I don't think. We'll put them on the list. But thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.